Thank you for coming. Welcome everyone to our third Tertulia of the winter season. This section we focused on big shakers around social movements. And I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The organizers of this event are on the unceded Wolastoqey territory covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. What we'd ask is that you consider the colonial relations of power that structure your own access to the lands in which you join us from, and the colonial relations of power that structure access to events like the one this evening. The Tertulias are put together by a group of scholars, including Tracy Glynn from St. Thomas University, Daniel Tubb from UNB, Matthew Hayes, also of St. Thomas University, and me, Christy Elaine from St. Thomas University. We have been really fortunate this season to have a selection of sponsors, including the Tobique River Trading Company, Between the Line Press, Verso, Fernwood Press, the MB Media Co-op, and the Atlantic Regional Solidarity Network. So we'd like to thank our sponsors for helping make this event possible. This is a really special event for me because it's a bit of a homecoming. So I'm very excited to introduce my colleague and friend, Sean Carlton, who will be introducing our speaker this evening. Sean is an assistant professor at University of Manitoba in history and Indigenous studies and has been a great friend and colleague to me since we did our PhDs together. So I'll turn it over to Sean. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christy. It's lovely to see everybody and everybody out there virtually. It really is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Bryan Palmer, an historian of labor and the left, who's authored 25 and co-authored and edited 25 volumes to his name, examining sundry subjects and that have been translated and republished in various languages from Portuguese to Korean. Bryan is also a regular writer for left-wing publications such as Canadian Dimension, Jacobin, and the Socialist Register, among others. So in short, Bryan's certainly a big shaker and someone worthy of being included in this lineup. Fittingly, for a prolific writer and a bibliophile, this spring, Ted McCoy, Julia Smith, and I have the good fortune of publishing an edited collection on the work, politics, and contributions of Bryan himself with Athabasca Press, which will be distributed by the University of Chicago Press for our American comrades out there. And here I'm sharing the Athabasca Press page for the book. The volume is called Dissenting Traditions, Essays on Bryan Palmer, Marxism and History, and features contributions from a variety of folks, including Alan Campbell, Alvin Finkel, Sam Giddin, Gregory S. Keeley, John McIlroy, Kirk Neergarth, Leo Panich, Chad Pearson, Sean Purdy, Nicholas Rogers, and Ted McCoy, Julia Smith, and I. The book should be available to order in the next couple of months, and I've put a link in the chat for those interested. So look forward look for the book and for some online launch events this spring and summer. Bryan was my PhD supervisor and continues to be a great mentor and friend. And I'm really looking forward to his talk tonight on the Canadian left in our epoch of declining expectations, which promises to be sobering, sure, but knowing Bryan also scattered with some inspiring lessons that can help us dream of a better world and fight to bring it into being. All right, over to you, Bryan.
Okay, well, thanks very much to Christy and Megan and others who have organized this, and to Sean for that very warm and nice introduction. It's great to see people, even if in this forum, and I'm delighted to be here, and I may try to shake up some conventional thoughts in the talk tonight. I think I'll probably try to keep this to about 40 minutes, maybe less, and have time for comments and discussions and criticisms and debates. I want to start with a paradox, a seeming contradiction. On the one hand, our current moment is one in which the broad ideas of the left seem to be, I think, to me, more widely accepted in society than at any previous time in history. Racism, misogyny, homophobia, disparagement of the disabled are now scorned in polite society in ways that they never would have been in the 1920s or even a few decades ago. Widespread empathy for people subject to myriad oppressions is now evident, and issues that in the lifetimes of some of us old enough to actually want to forget were simply unimaginable are now being addressed, among them the necessity of confronting how transgendered people negotiate their identities in worlds structured around very fixed understandings of gender. Race, I think, is arguably perhaps the central issue in all of this, particularly in the United States, with Black slavery and its legacies, as well as the means of atoning for this original American sin, receiving more attention and debate than I think at any time in the past. This encompasses discussions of reparations, rewritings of history and the educational curriculum, and much talk of revamping healthcare and housing to address the ongoing consequences of systemic discrimination, which register in our times in the obviously disproportionate numbers of African Americans, Latinos dying of COVID-19. In Canada, race, which was once considered the way in which French Canada was subordinated, is now centrally addressed through discussions of Indigenous peoples. Colonialism and its impact is virtually inescapable, I would argue, in Canada, unless you refuse to turn on the CBC. You live isolated without access to books and newspapers and television and Trudeau. And all of this, I think, speaks volumes about a political culture more open in our times to sensibilities and sensitivities that would generally be recognized as progressive and left. You can call it political correctness or woke, if you will. It is nevertheless a socio-cultural political fact, and it is demographically tracking into the future, by which I mean that this progressive ethos is embraced by more and more young people. All the old shit, as Marx would have said, is being cast aside, at least among a very significant portion of the population. And this, I expect, is news to no one in this audience. That said, I come to what I see as the other side of this paradox, which may well generate questioning, even challenges and repudiations, and perhaps even some anger among some of you. For the flip side of this acceptance of left ideas, in my view, is my insistence that the left has never, in more than 125 years at least, been weaker and less consequential. And I base this assertion first on an understanding that the left is organized, or it is less than what a left needs to be. And in asserting that such a left is now weak and inconsequential, indeed little more than a pale reflection of what it has historically been, I rely on a basic canvassing of left-wing political organizations and bodies and movements. Where is the Communist Party that in Canada was a presence in the labor movement, reaching from the 1920s into the 1970s? When Tim Buck, who was head of the Communist Party of Canada, ran for the leadership of the Trades and Labor Congress of Canada in the 1920s, he could garner almost 1/4 of the vote. Today's trade unions harbor few whose unreconstructed leftism registers in unambiguous stands. In the United States, this Communist Party was a significant presence in the labor movement, could galvanize hundreds of thousands to protest the railroading to the electric chair of the Italian-American anarchist Sacco and Vanzetti in 1927, mobilized the unemployed and the unorganized in the Great Depression, championed Paul Robeson in the 1940s and 1950s at peace concerts, and played a role in strikes defending Cuba and demonstrating against war throughout the 60s and the 70s. And by this late date, a new left had emerged, and its vocal networks springboarded into being campaigns and massive anti-war protests that electrified students, galvanized working class youth, and even drew some in the trade union movement into momentous events that rocked the world from Paris to Mexico City, from Karachi to Melbourne, the tocsin of 1968 ringing across the globe. Out of this new left and the disintegrating body of Communist Party Stalinism emerged not only the modern women's liberation movement, but a plethora of Trotskyist and Maoist new communist currents that flourished in the early 1970s and commanded the attention of radicalizing elements among youth and in the trade unions. The gay movement, while it has roots in previous times, largely dates from this post-Stonewall 1969 moment. For a time, trade union leaders like Jean-Claude Perrault of the Canadian Postal Workers took stands of resolute left-wing intransigence, battling states and courts and reactionary employers. And they did this precisely because they were both a part of this left-wing ferment and because the presence of this left pushed labor officialdoms to acknowledge their better selves. The organized left that existed in this not so distant past made bodies like the Canadian New Democratic Party more left-wing, not less, although the NDP always did what it could to stifle revolutionaries and radicals in its midst, from those opposing NATO in the 1950s to those fighting for an independent socialist Canada in the waffle movement of the party in the late 60s and early 70s. This organized left again made the trade unions both more radical and more effective, although again, these left-wing currents faced concerted opposition from mainstream elements and their ossified bureaucracies. Communists were driven from the labor movement during the Cold War. New leftists were marginalized within the unions in the 60s and 70s. This left wing strengthened immeasurably the women's movement, playing a key role in militant defenses of Dr. Henry Morgenthaler and advocating for a woman's right to choose, equal pay for equal work, and extending childcare. But that organized left is no more. From the mid-70s to the present, it has withered and died. Stalinism imploded, finally and decisively, crashing the forces of communist parties around the world. The 1956 Khrushchev speech that revealed Stalin's atrocities, which of course had been evident for anyone who would look since the 1930s, was followed by the suppression of popular uprisings in the Soviet satellites of Hungary and Czechoslovakia in 1956 and 1968. An exodus from the ranks of the Communist Party continued, the final denouements of the 1980s, commencing with the Polish Solidarność and detouring to the events in Tiananmen Square, and ending with the crash of the Berlin Wall, wrote a final fini to Stalinist communisms of various kinds. But its replacement with the slow death march from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin was no better, and has culminated in the rule of ruthless oligarchs who combine the worst appetites, agendas, and autocracy of degenerated communism and predatory capitalism. The new communist organization spawned in the fracturing of the new left, meanwhile, imploded. This is a story written in the pages of our text of modern revolutionary activism as a fragmenting impulse in which the politics of identity trump the politics of class. Women and gays and racialized groups found in far left organizations too much of an accent on the old left's focus on class and too little attention paid to the special oppressions that would foment so many modern day social movements. There was this difficult reckoning with the politics of inclusion, to be sure, but these new left implosions were also intensified by state repression and by the dirty tricks of police agencies. In Britain, a recent undercover police inquiry has recently established that between 1966 and 2005, over 30 female activists were targeted by cops who had wormed their way into left organizations and mobilizations, establishing intimate relations with women, even fathering children with them, all the while informing on them, burglaring the organizations they were affiliated with, and making a mockery of the civil liberties of such activists. Often these undercover agents were married with families already established. Their wives didn't even know that they had established new relationships. In one case of an activist who had a child with one of these moles, he abruptly disappeared from their lives once he was pulled out of his assignment, abandoning the woman he had fathered a child with and the child. When questioned about the morality of such behavior, one such undercover officer declared that it was all part of the job, rather like infiltrating a drug ring and having to taste the cocaine or the heroin to determine its quality. The left was likened to a product to be sampled to establish your bona fides. To add insult to injury, one of the first undercover operations to target British New Leftists and anti-Vietnam War protesters within the London Metropolitan Police was designated the Special Demonstration Squad, its acronym SDS, the same as the radical student organizations that rose to prominence in Germany and the United States in the mid to late 1960s. In Canada in the 1970s, this kind of surveillance also happened, with psychiatrists' offices being broken into to secure files on left-wing activists who had sought therapy or counseling. In the United States, where such surveillance took its most extreme forms, the infamous counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, established by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI in 1956, targeted leftist groups and individuals associated with the Communist Party, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and the American Indian Movement, among many, many such organizations. They utilized psychological warfare, disinformation, provocateurs, harassment, and even assassination, the killing of Chicago Panther leader Fred Hampton being perhaps the most nefarious case. Now, such repression was both personal and political and registered as such. And it unfolded alongside the more distant but decisive material consequences of capitalist belt tightening attendant on ongoing economic crises, which were perhaps felt most acutely in the defensive organizations of the working class, the trade unions themselves. Because the trade unions were fundamentally organs of economic purpose, as the capitalist economy descended into a whirlwind of routinized and repetitive crises in the post-1973 years, a crisis-ridden order which I expect many in this audience have lived only through and not before. Working people's frontline organizations became targeted in an endless war by governments in Canada, federal and provincial, and were backed by recalcitrant employers, regardless of whether they were in the public or the private sector. Leo Panitch and Don Schwartz together, and Thomas Workman, have detailed the shifting fortunes of class war affecting adversely the labor movement, which has seen the percentage of Canada's workforce afforded trade union protections shrink. The statistics of demise are unambiguous. The overall rate of Canadian unionization dropped almost 10% over the course of the 1980s and 90s and has declined further subsequently. As workers struggled to strike, they were legislated back to work by the state or suffocated by recurring crises and rising unemployment rates. Real wages, trending downward since 1982, have stagnated, resulting in household savings as a percentage of earnings dropping precipitously and the burden of debt rising consequentially. With employment opportunities curtailed by plant closures and lack of economic growth outside of the gig economy and its precarious employments, militancy takes a backseat to survival. Between 1974 and 1985, the number of Canadian strikes averaged 900 annually. In the years 1995 to 2007, this figure dropped to 261, and with some yearly totals barely scraped past the 100 mark. This has only worsened in recent years. The strike is not extinct in Canada, but it is an endangered species of class activity. Not only do workers backed into cul-de-sacs of unemployment and precarity rarely take aggressive job action, those whose workplaces are shuttered during a pandemic, like we are experiencing now, almost never do. As if this worsening economic climate was not depressing enough in its effects on working class combativity, the ideological universe of capitalism also shifted gears, ramming down hard on a consensus that had been developing in the post-World War II period, composed of Keynesianism, support for the welfare state, and a post-war settlement which recognized unions and collective bargaining. Neoliberalism, which developed and grew phenomenally in the post-1975 years, resurrected the disciplinary, invisible hand of the marketplace as the arbiter of all politics and human relations. Right-wing economics, with their accent on tax cuts, deregulation, and surveillance of the dispossessed, licensed reactionary impulses in other spheres, prying open a Pandora's box of white supremacy, immigrant bashing, and anti-women ideologies. This further fueled the sharp turn to the right as neoconservatism morphed into populist acquisitive individualism, in which virtually anything right-wing, however crazed, became normalized. Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Jair Bolsonaro, neo-fascist militias, and QAnon conspiracies. In political economies such as Canada, more moderate perhaps, where such right-wing populism is less likely to take its most extreme forms, the political spectrum nonetheless shifted dramatically to the right. The pink Toryism of a John Robarts and a Bill Davis that some of us grew up with has largely disappeared, replaced by the more hard right of Stephen Harper and worse. Even when such recalcitrant right-wingers lose their grip on federal power, they are shored up by a stranglehold on provincial governments, and the mainstream alternative, the Liberal Party, tilts ever more heavily toward a corporate agenda. Trudeau Jr. is much different than the Trudeau Sr. of the late 1960s, who at least talked rhetorically of participatory democracy and fueled the fires of a particular kind of economic nationalism. All of this underscores the sorry state that the politics of our time finds itself in, and the left is impaled upon. But wait, some will argue, the left has never been stronger. Last week, for instance, I gave a talk to the Marxist Education Project in New York, where the young man sharing the Zoom session nodded knowingly at what I was saying. It wasn't the same talk, it was very different, but some of the same themes came up, and asked me to respond to those, like the broad membership of the Democratic Socialists of America, who insist that the left has actually never been stronger. DSA, which supports Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, aka AOC, is a large and influential caucus within the Democratic Party. On paper, it is left-wing, espousing universal health care, the $15 minimum wage, and a host of other eminently left-wing reforms. Over the past decade, the DSA has mushroomed from a current within the Democratic Party commanding the allegiance of 5,000 or 6,000 to, as of November of last year, over 85,000. It has grown as large left-wing groups like the International Socialist Organization, established in 1966, and adhering in some ways to Trotskyist and Leninist political positions, fractured in 2019, dissolving itself and liquidating into the Democratic Party. Part of the process of this death of the far left that I commenced the paper with. DSA also serves as something of a magnet within mainstream politics for youth captivated by Sanders radicalism and moving politically towards socialism. The Times claimed DSA spokespersons have never been better, not for the left anyway, which has never been stronger in their view. This, I think, is an illusion. My questioner in the Marxist Education Project, himself affiliated with DSA, has become frustrated because, in his view, every attempt to raise left-wing issues within this ostensibly socialist DSA tend to be crushed in the avalanche of bowing and scraping to Biden. Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has done her bit to stifle efforts to put universal health care back on the agenda. I see that she's very upset with Biden for refusing to, last night, countenance the forgiveness of student debt up to $50,000, but she has not said anything, to my knowledge, I think it will come, of Biden's backtracking on the $15 minimum wage, which he pretty much repudiated. The Democratic Party, like the New Democratic Party in Ontario, is, I would argue, where revolutionaries and the left go to die rather than to be reborn or revitalized. A reading of Mike Davis's first book, Prisoners of the American Dream, establishes this definitively. If I was like Sean, I would have little PowerPoints to do this, but I am not that capable. These mainstream parties have drifted with the politics of our time, and the Democratic Party is often little better than the Republicans. On foreign policy issues, for instance, there are as many hawks among the Democrats as there are in the party of Trump, and possibly far fewer outright isolationists who, for whatever their reasoning, at least don't fan the flames of American imperialism as vigorously as do the likes of, for instance, Hillary Clinton or even Joe Biden. But the Democratic Party might need Sanders and the squad is true enough that it will ever really countenance their policies, which are really not much more than rather tepid social democracy, is simply not believable. Biden's rise to the presidency, which owes everything to Trump, was proof positive that if anything suggestive of even the mildest variant of socialism threatens to rise to the level of leadership or policy, there are legions within the Democratic Party ready to crush this incipient insurgency. At the same time, of course, that its advocates are labeled radicals and communists by Trump and his ill-informed militias, and many others. Donald Trump referred to the two recently elected Georgia senators as, for instance, radical communists. They are anything but. The NDP is little better, having long abandoned use of the S word, socialism. Canada's New Democrats have a long history of snuffing out any semblance of left-wing politics, and they have long left behind the radicalism of the CCF, which is their legacy. It's time that those who embrace the NDP as a political answer on the left acknowledge this history and come to grips with what I would argue is the futility of left-wing activism within Canada's party of social democracy. The modern NDP has, in the words of a recently deceased colleague, Wayne Roberts, given away too many miracles. In the 1990 election, which saw Bob Rae and the NDP elected to govern in Ontario, it took a metaphorical political minute for Rae to backtrack on essential progressive electoral promises, to appeal to Wall Street for support, and move to constrain the unions with a so-called social contract that gutted collective agreements and limited wage gains. Rae, of course, eventually jumped ship to the Liberals. Thomas Mulcair, a neoliberal social democrat with more Margaret Thatcher in him than Marx, threw away a possible federal NDP victory in the 2015 election, opting to run on balancing the budget, allowing a freewheeling Justin Trudeau to sweep to an unanticipated victory because of his promise to spend rather than constrain government monies. And what really, we should ask now, does a balanced budget look like in 2020's pandemic reality? The NDP used to be regarded on the left as liberals in a hurry. Now they look somewhat like Tories going slow. As much as many leftists want to place a great deal of stock in the British Labour Party, its record is little different. The Labour government of Harold Wilson, ostensibly left-wing in the 1960s, was complicit in the Vietnam atrocities, which factored into the upsurge of protests, culminating in a 200,000-strong anti-war rally in Hyde Park in October 1968. Under the leadership of Tony Blair, the Labour Party backed American imperialism in the Iraq War in 2003. In the interval between these two low points, a left resurgence occurred in the Labour Party, led by Tony Benn. But he was crushed. Following disillusionment with the neoliberal turn to the politics of Blair's Third Way, this trajectory was reversed as Jeremy Corbyn took the reins of the Labour Party leadership and did rather well. But like Ben, he too has been given a public drumming. The hope that springs eternal among leftists that social democratic parties like the NDP or the Labour Party or the left-wing currents within the mainstream parties like that of the US Democrats can be the path for left-wing victories has historically led to very little. Indeed, putting one's left-wing eggs in this mainstream basket often leaves them little more than progressively broken. Our current conjuncture demands not the fostering of this grand historical illusion, but a refusal to countenance it anymore. But precisely because the left has been decimated over the course of the last 50 years, and precisely because the trade union movement, as the organized expression of working class people, has also been on the skids, the tasks of the current moment are indeed, I recognize, daunting. Acceptance of the chimera that the left is strong is unhelpful, and is only sustained by continuing to cling to the view that electoral machines like the NDP, the Labour Party, and the Democrats are our only hope, when in actuality, they are certainly a part of our problem. Too often, moreover, given the awful political times we are confronted with, there is an inclination to insist that now is not the time to demand more, but either to suck in our belts, compromise, or accept less in the name of defeating the truly evil entity. To defeat Stephen Harper, we must vote Liberal. To defeat the Bush dynasty, vote Democrat. To defeat Donald Trump, we must have and embrace arguably the most insipid presidential candidate in modern American history, a less than mentally acute and congenital opponent of radicalism, Joe Biden, whose running mate, Kamala Harris, parades with Black Lives Matter while having a history as California's chief cop of accelerating mass incarceration and laughing about jailing Black mothers on petty drug charges. To defeat evil, embrace mediocrity and compromise. To defeat the right, refuse the left and occupy the center. This is the politics of our diminished expectations. Neoliberalism's rise not only contaminated the politics of the state and the framing of policy, it also diluted the left. A strong case can be made that all manner of postmodern thought, which throughout the 80s and 90s eroded foundational materialist sensibilities and relegated historical materialism and Marxism to the dustbin of outmoded master narratives, was in actuality a neoliberal assault on many of the intellectual, analytical, and political premises that had historically sustained the left. An important edited collection of essays by Daniel Zamora and Michael Behart, Foucault and Neoliberalism, is a must-read, I think, in this regard. In this sense, the turn to subjectivity which postmodernism validated was the pseudo-left equivalent of the resurgence of the right, most evident in the reification of the market that animated Milton Friedman and his minions. So-called leftists were unlikely to be entranced by the idolization of the market that Friedrich Hayek's successors promoted so successfully as an antidote to the fiscal crisis of capitalist states in the 1970s. But they did find in the turn to relativism and repudiation of collectivity and interpretive generalization a congenial path away from what were now conceived as the youthful excesses and failures of the 1960s. In the ramped up ideology of acquisitive individualism that has overtaken so much in our times, Friedman and the Chicago School spoke to acquisition, the late Foucault to individualism, denials of power's concentration in specific, identifiable material interests, and the pleasures of the self. Both of these currents dealt body blows to understandings of collective responsibility that had long grounded the program of the left. Not surprisingly, many progressives, formerly aligned in one way or another with Marxism, abandoned various ships in the 80s and 90s to embrace the politics of particularity, rejecting what they regarded as a universalistic reductionism of a left-wing fixation on class. As Touré Reed has argued in, I think, a very important recent book, Toward Freedom, the Case Against Race Reductionism, what has been too often lost in the name of a left aligned with the Democratic Party but unorganized outside of it is a jettisoning of politics and policies that would sustain the struggle to materially overcome systemic racism by demanding that inequality be challenged by programs and initiatives that address the needs of poor Blacks and whites. Both groups have been adversely affected by deindustrialization, automation, precarity, and low-wage work. Addressing this reality will go a long way towards striking needed blows against a racialized order at the same time as it will reignite the possibilities of aligning the poor and the dispossessed of all colors in movements of a common struggle. For instance, a $15 minimum wage will strike a blow at racisms of all kinds for racialized peoples, Black, brown, red, and yellow, work overwhelmingly in the low-wage sector. And that's why I think Biden's backtracking on this $15 minimum wage in last night's town hall was particularly noteworthy. Now, in an underappreciated satire of the politics of accommodation in the 1990s, Warren Beatty's Bulworth provides a stark, if outlandish, commentary on the class and race realities of our time. If we were an audience, I'd ask how many have seen this, and I suppose there's a way of doing that on the screen, and popping up with comments, but I'm going to avoid it. It's an outlandish commentary on the class and race realities of our time, but it nevertheless captures a great deal. A jaded Clinton Democrat, Senator J. Billington Bulworth, played by Beatty, asked the streetwise Black daughter of a 1960s militant, Nina, played by Halle Berry, why do you think there are no more Black leaders? Nina's staccato-like response is telling. Some people think that's because they all got killed, but I think it has more to do with the decimation of the manufacturing base in the urban centers. An optimist, energized population throws up optimistic, energized leadership. When you shift manufacturing to the Sun Belt into the third world, you destroy the blue-collar base of the Black activist population. I'm just a materialist at heart. Look at the economic base. Higher domestic employment means jobs for African Americans. That is what energized the community for the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s. An energized, hopeful community will not only produce leaders, but leaders they will respond to. Bulworth, despairing of life in the fake politics of capitalism, corruption, and the unbridled power of class interests, takes his ultra-cynicism to a political rally at a black church in Compton. He's asked by an irate African-American woman if he is actually telling his constituents that the Democratic Party does not care about black well-being. Isn't it obvious, Bulworth rants? You've got half of your kids out of work and the other half in jail. Do you see any Democrat doing anything about it? Come on, what are you going to do? Vote Republican? This caricature paints a picture of a particular political reality. And it brings home the necessity of a left staking its claim to change that political reality on being decisively, unambiguously, and unequivocally anti-capitalist. That demands building the broadest possible base of opposition, uniting the varied layers of the dispossessed, whatever their seeming difference. But if this is to be done, it cannot happen inside parties that have long hitched their wagon to capitalism's horses. The task of the current moment, then, is to rebuild the revolutionary left and simultaneously shore up and revitalize a sagging labor movement. These are crucial building blocks in any left revival worthy of the name. By definition, such cornerstones of a new edifice of the left will be resolutely anti-capitalist. They will be laid effectively by regrouping fragments of an organized left that is now very much in disarray and dissipation, and by winning new recruits to socialism, not by following paths of the least resistance and settling for lowest common denominator entries into parties led by the likes of Biden, Ray, Mulcair, and others. The difficult task of addressing long vexing questions, judged arcane and sectarian, may well have to be revisited and reformulated. But the project must be to align those consciously on the left, developing their capacity to collectively pose a coherent and relentless anti-capitalist politics. This cannot be done without interacting with the single and still most important organization of the working class, without which no left-wing advance is possible, the trade union movement. Left caucuses must be established in the unions, independent of long compromised labor bureaucracies, and a fighting spirit reintroduced to trade union bodies and new layers of leadership. In my view, the left cannot be regrouped and revitalized without developing an approach to workers' organizations, and those organizations cannot be jump-started if there is not a left presence to push them in their politics of opposition. The struggle is for simultaneously rebuilding the left and the labor movement with an understanding that, one, these related constituencies can only develop and thrive reciprocally, and two, if they are to do this, they must interact with and politically intersect a plethora of social movements and coalitions with whom they share a project of social transformation and reconstruction, even if many in those mobilizations currently view this labor left with somewhat jaundiced eyes. Now, this is not an easy task, and it is not comfortable. It is not as comfortable as finding a niche in an existing party structure where one's contentment at being part of a small left wing is abundantly clear after every meeting and after every annual conference. It is a different project than tweeting and Facebooking and platform pontificating about the injustices of the world, however necessary this activity may be, and however valuable it potentially can be in organizing and bringing people to events, rallies, and protests. Much of what happens now, especially on various digital platforms, is no doubt important, but if a reasonable percentage of the time people spent tweeting, blogging, and networking in the name of the left was actually devoted to building left organization, think of where we might be. The project of revitalizing the left demands an appreciation of old left commitments to parties, institutions, and structures, with the current left's technical capabilities with social media and the possibilities that it might register in a digital age. In the process, some new wine can perhaps find a home in historically suggestive vessels, and how we are then able to drink may refresh us all. I realize that this is anything but an upbeat reflection of our current political impasse, but the times are dire. They demand a shaking up of complacency. The right, as recent events in the United States has shown, is now known as the radicalizing element in society, whereas since the Great Depression at least, radicalization has historically been associated with the left. This right-wing radicalization is in part a consequence of capital's failures to deliver peace, land, and bread. I harken back to Russia in 1905. Instead, we have endless threats of various wars, And we have wars of each against all. And above all, in 2020 and 21, we have a war of nature violated, the pandemic, which is waged against humankind as a whole, that has registered in millions of deaths and economic dislocation not seen since the 1930s. The land is despoiled, the bread is wanting. Capitalism's death march is accelerating, threatening as it never has before. Once progressive, capital as a social force is now largely destructive. Its inherent tendency towards crisis is both accelerating in terms of the recurrence of routinized crises, and with its destruction of nature and the climate change intensifying with respect to the devastation it engenders. The minuscule numbers of people who benefit from this system nonetheless reap huge rewards, advancing global inequality in all kinds of ways. Consciously exploited by right-wing elements that have been hugely successful in promoting, and here I use a very unpopular term, but one that I think registers in the current moment, in promoting false consciousness among a contingent of the dispossessed. Capitalist crises are now endemic, but capitalism itself is definitely not in crisis, and it is defiantly so. And it will not be in crisis until there is an organized left able to displace the right and to challenge capitalism with the promise and possibility of socialism. Lapsing into moral contentment, resting on complacent assurances that as leftists we are better than our opponents, and our humane refusals of racism, misogyny, and bigotries of all kind, is not a substitute for defeating the right and the capitalism that sustains all of this. We need to retake the initiative of radicalization that has been appropriated by the right. A loud and passionate and creative voice of the 19th century left, William Morris addressed audiences large and small in his struggle to make socialists and build socialist organization. Often he spoke to a handful of people at a time when the prospects of the left seemed dim indeed. Morris often commenced with the statement, "It is to stir you up not to be content with a little that I am here tonight." And that too is my intent. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that.